Hetepu, Assalamu alaikum, Namaste, Haru Nefer. This is Kasank Ma Keparu with an exclusive video for my Patreon supporters, and I'm happy to say that this is our first Maat book club meeting. So we're going to be covering Maat, the 11 Laws of God by Ra'u Nefer Amin in this book club, and we're going to be going over the first 35 pages, and we're going to get really, really deep into Maat. Who is she as a Kinetic Egyptian goddess? What's her background? And how we can better understand her so that we can live according to Ma'at, which is truth. All right. So I am thankful and glad that you're able to attend and watch this video. And I'm also thankful that you are a Patreon supporter. So I want to say thanks for that. Make sure you hit the like button on this video. And let's get into it, shall we? Now, again, this is based on Maat's 11 Laws of God by Ra'u Nefer Amen. And we're going to be covering this every Thursday at this time at 7 p.m. Pacific time. So tune back in next Thursday to follow up on part 2. And we'll be doing this for the month of October, covering the book, getting deep into Maat. And if you don't have the book and you're interested in purchasing it, you can get it on Amazon.com. They have the book, and it's really a phenomenal book. I was looking to see what book could we start in this book club as the first one. Of course, is the famous book, well-known book, the Metuneta Volume 1. And I decided that to do this book because many people who had read the book said they had trouble understanding the concepts. And I said, well, this is a perfect opportunity to really dive deep into this and explain those concepts so that people can have a better understanding of Ma'at. And I also believe that especially you'll see in the so-called Hotep community, there are a lot of people professing to understand Ma'at or know Ma'at, and they really don't. You know, what we have to understand is we're living in a Western society, which is predominantly left brain, and left brain thinks in terms of segregative thought process or the segregative faculty, syllogistic logic, and it looks to concrete thinking. So when people talk about Ma'at, those study Kemetic philosophy and Kemetic religion, they look at it from a very Western perspective of just understanding the tenets of laws or truths. And that's not really what Ma'at is about, because Ma'at is synthesis thinking. She's integrative thinking. She is contextual or relational thinking. And that's very important for you to understand. She's homeopathic. So you look at the Chinese and their homeopathic medicine, they look to get to the root cause of an illness and not just the symptoms or curing the symptoms. And that's a big difference in the way we're living our lives now, because the way we're living our lives now is polarized thinking, left brain thinking. We don't integrate with the right brain. You know, we engage in what we call the Hegelian dialectic, which is you take your thesis and then you have an antithesis. And already you set yourself up for failure because you're saying if you have the good, you must have the bad. And Maat tells us that one is one half of a whole, that there's oneness, there's a whole there, and that there's an integration or an integral part that fits in with the whole, meaning that there's a form function relationship, there's an interdependence relationship. For example, God depends on you, God needs you, because your consciousness is within God, or God's consciousness is within you, excuse me. And God, this is how God experiences the 4D world. Because God cannot just manifest in this 4D world, because God is Amen, immaterial, imperceptible, no one thing, no thingness. So I want to set the backdrop to Ma'at before we get into this book, so you have a really rich understanding of who this deity is, this beautiful goddess is, and what she means. First and foremost, let's understand from a background perspective who she is. I'm going to reference the Metuneta Volume 1. We know that Ma'at is the goddess of truth, justice, and righteousness. Her sphere on the tree of life is number 4. Her number is 2, if you're into numerology. Her planet is Jupiter. Her day is Thursday. Her color is sky blue for spiritual purposes and yellow for planetary Hakao. Her metals or gems are yellow sapphire, lapis lazuli, and tin. And the time of the year is the cylindrical full moon in Pisces. Now, her incense, if you're going to do ritual meditation, is aloes and anise, I'm sorry. And this is an important part. Her mantra, when you recite it, changes your core vibrational frequency to help you to live truth. So her mantra is Shireen. And you would first put ahead of that Om Shireen, Om Shireen. And reciting that would make you more loving, more caring, more willing to share. All right. Her spiritual direction is southwest. Her mundane direction is west. Now let's talk a little bit about her in terms of her emotional traits. She's just, holistic, generous, sharing, optimistic, liberal, magnanimous, moral, sense, striving for advancement and wealth in a positive manner, religious, successful, fortunate, law abiding, fair, charitable, deferring to elders, and no trafficking with evil or people or circumstances. Her mental traits are synthesis, gaining insight into things by unifying them through the use of abstract analogies, hence well fitted for philosophical and theoretical scientific religious pursuits. So let us understand that the world is governed by Maat's complement, which is Sebek or Anubis. Sebek is segregative syllogistic thinking, meaning he thinks in like compartmentalized and concrete. Whereas Maat, as we said, is synthesis. She gains insight into unifying things. So you must understand that when you're looking at the Western world and you see the mushrooming of racism and sexism coming to fruition, you can only attribute that to segregative thinking, syllogistic thinking. Sebek sits on the throne. We have elevated the idea of left brain logic to such a degree that we have basically not encompassed morality, which is Ma'at. And also, mathematics comes from Ma'at, but I'm getting ahead of myself. You will see in career functions that she is judges, very experienced lawyers, theoretical scientists, theoreticians, theologians, bishops, cardinals, bankers, merchants, upper echelon priests and priestesses, fortune hunter, and officials and managers. She walks with a papyrus scepter. She achieves abundance. Ma'at papyrus scepter fuses divine law with the abundance that's following from living it. Its color is green, symbolizing abundance and fruitfulness, while the papyrus, which was used for writing, symbolizes the book of the law. She realizes that even her enemies are integral parts of the whole. I'm going to say that again. She realizes that even her enemies are integral parts of the whole and thus works and shares with them. She shares with her enemies because they have a genuine need for it. Sishet raises her consciousness to the hall of the Metuneta and realizes the ultimate unity of all things. If we were in a society that was based on Ma'at, whole brain thinking, synthesis thinking, there would be no racism and sexism. There would be no poverty in the sense that we're experiencing it today. There would be no corruption in government. See, in ancient Kemet in Egypt and most of Africa, there was no police force. The nation was cultivated on spiritual principles, on Ma'at, through rituals, which programmed the subconscious mind to live truth in the face of the greatest challenges. So there was no inclination to do wrong. There was no inclination to be a serial killer, to be a thief, to engage in pedophilia. That was absent from traditional Egypt and African cultures, and we didn't see the birth of that until the rise of the Greek and Roman cultures. Ma tells us that there are no irreconcilable opposites in the world. Everything serves to further. This is the source of undaunted optimism, faith, and inner joy, which reveals themselves in a peaceful, genuine smile and relaxed hetep state of being, even in the midst of setbacks and the greatest of external difficulties. Maat is optimistic because she knows that even her enemies are one with her. Hence, why in the story of Asar and Set, Haru did not kill Set, because he knew that Seth served a vital role and that Seth was a part of him. Maat, the divine law, is the food and drink of Ra, the life force. She nourishes her life force, Ra, with the divine law and gives endlessly of her love, shares, seeking nothing in return. Maat gives, seeking nothing in return. There is no end to her worldly fortune, as her giving is unanswered from the depths of Nut. God is abundance. You can neither add to it, or subtract from it. You have no cause to fear when you share, even with your enemies, because you know that the fundamental principle of your being and of God is abundance. You will always have. Perseverance in adhering to a belief system based on the cosmological arrangement and modest cosmology, cosmological thinking, and synthesis of divine laws, such as achieved through the tree of life, leads to success in all undertakings, as a view of the unity that is concealed in the midst of the multiplicity that life presents to us and is never lost. A collection of wise saying and divine laws, however true, cannot save us if they are not arranged in an integral system of guiding us in our day-to-day existence. We have seen how the abstract analogies presented in this book, essentially the symbols of the tree of life, which we're going to examine, serves to unify specifics across general categories. Unless the elements making up our belief system, whether secular or religious, are unified in this manner, they become enslaving agents of dogma instead of vehicles for salvation. So when you read the book of the Bible, the books of the Bible, they set you up with an enemy, not as integral parts of the whole, not in terms of unifying principles, but as outside external villains that must be overcome. And this is the cause of the problems in the world, seeing your enemy as your enemy or seeing someone else as opposing you. Because Maat tells us everything is interdependent and interrelated, one half of a whole. So I want to now let's take a look. I'm going to share my screen to get a better understanding of Maat here. And I had some trouble sharing it before. Let me see if I can bring my presentation up here, if that will work. All right, share screen. All right, let's take a look at this now. This is Maat, and she's usually depicted, of course, as a female with an ostrich feather and holding an ankh. All right. And that's important. The feather is important symbolism, as well as the ankh in ancient Kemet. From Maat, we get the modern day idea of justice and the scales of justice, because Maat was also depicted holding the scales. But unlike the modern day pictorial representation of justice, where one scale is heavier than the other, Maat's scales are balanced. Maat also deals with the hall of justice, or Ma'ati, where when you transition and pass on, you go before the judgment scene to have your heart weighed against the feather, because your heart must weigh lighter than the feather. And here is the ancient Egyptian depiction of the hall of justice and the weighing of the words. You'll see Sebek as he inspects the scales to make sure they're accurate, because Sebek deals with detail, left brain thinking. We see Tahuti, who is her mate, her husband, her brother. He is the scribe. He is consciousness. He is the sage, recording everything. Up atop, we see the judge, Osair, sitting in judgment. He is qualified to judge because he has moved beyond emotions. He cannot be influenced and swayed. And here we see, I think this is Annie, being led to the hall of justice for the weighing of the heart. His heart is placed on one side of the scale, and then the feather on the other. His heart must weigh lighter than the feather. And as such, he is said to be light-hearted. He has not taken anything in life to heart. And here we have Amit, who is the, right down here too, the devourer of souls. If your heart is heavier than the feather, he will devour your soul. Okay? That is the depiction of the hall of justice. Along with that, when you're escorted there, you will recite the 42 negative confessions. And extrapolated from that is the modern day or biblical 10 commandments, as we'll see here. And one would go and say, I have not done this. I have not spoken negatively against others. And you're saying these things to proclaim what you have not done, to say you have lived a just life. And over here we see the 10 commandments, which have taken from Maat's 42 negative confessions. A plagiarized version of that. Now let's go take a look at the family tree here. We know that Maat, again pictured with the ostrich feather, is the daughter of Ra, father of the gods. And Maat is married to Tahuti. And Tahuti, again, is the scribe. Tahuti is God's mouthpiece, wisdom. You see, Maat lays down the law, but Tahuti is the measure of the law and dictates how the law must be applied. You must take in consideration the person's heart, what their intentions are, before you can apply the law. Thou shalt not kill is what the 10 Commandments tells us. But then that is a law, but Tahuti would tell us that in some situations, such as self-defense, it is okay to kill. In modern times, we're dealing with an evil judicial system which disproportionately locks up people of color in this country and does not apply the law equally, nor does it look at the intent or the heart of the person. It's purely based on facts. Let me give you an example. Sebek is facts, Sebek is logic. You walk into a room, you see a man standing over his wife. His wife has a wound in her back, a gunshot wound, and he's standing over her holding the gun, the smoking gun. Based on the facts, our system of laws would conclude that he shot his wife. But what is the truth of that? And only from wisdom, from your third eye, your uchat, can you decipher the truth. And then we could easily see that he walked in, saw his wife sitting there, and picked up the gun in shock. But this society would lock you away based on those facts, because we don't cultivate wisdom. We don't cultivate Tahuti. We take laws and we apply them dogmatically without consideration for the truth, which is, as I said before, relational thinking, contextual thinking. A man cannot be a man without the context of a woman to define him. You cannot have hot and label it as hot if you have nothing to compare it to. So you must have cold. Those are complementary elements, but in society, they're looked at as contradictory elements, opposing one another. Maat tells us that all of those things are unified, and we should never see them as opposites or oppositions. Getting to cosmology, or cosmologics, I'm sorry, we see here the tree of life, or the Port Neteru. Maat is on the fourth sphere, and her number is 2. So when you are a student of spiritual culture, you start at Geb, the very bottom, and you work your way up through each sphere, learning the truisms of each deity. And these truisms, when recited in trance state, have a transformational approach to your psyche. Because we understand Set, Isis, which is trance. That anything that's taken into trance is believed, and as I teach, creates your 4D experience. And that at each level, as you climb up the tree of life, you become more and more a spiritual being. You start at the Sahu level, the animal level, where you're battling your animalistic instincts. You graduate and you go up to the Ab and the Ba level until you become Oser. And Oser at the top is the integrative faculty. He is unity, not taking any one side beyond the influence of emotions. Once you graduate from the Ma'at level, you then have access to God's spiritual power, Sekert, and God's wisdom, Tehuti. Because God is not going to give you spiritual power, access to that, or his wisdom, unless you are living truth. Now, as I said before, Ma'at and Tehuti are husband and wife, brother and sister. So Ma'at is the law. Tehuti is the measure of the law. Now, the law means nothing if you cannot enforce it. So in order to enforce the law, Ma'at sends Harukuhuti, the warrior god, god of justice, to bring back balance and harmony, not to inflict pain or punishment, but to bring back balance. And our justice system is screwed up because it locks men and women away without any hope of them being reconditioned or changing of their ways, reforming. In fact, they become master criminals in jail because you put them away with people who are confirmed wrongdoers, who have graduated with a PhD in criminality. So you make the person worse with no hope of reform. But this makes sense because we're not dealing with a just system which seeks to balance things out. In traditional African society, when someone was doing wrong, it was the society or the nation that was held accountable for this. They had to look and see, how did they fail the individual? In this world, there are all types of wayward and backwards behavior that are put in place by institutions, because those institutions have failed individuals in this country. And instead of holding accountable the institutions for what they have done, we lock up the individual. We don't see how this society has cultivated negative behavior and how that has a profound impact on a person's upbringing and psyche. So the blame is solely placed on the individual and not the state, not the nation. We don't hold a nation accountable to uphold moral principles. Well, what do you expect? Because they separated church and state. So this is the roadmap, the cosmological perspective on all of the truths or the deities that govern your being. And now, taking this back to Maat and 11 laws, let us begin and dive into this. And I'll just read the preface by Ron Neff. The 11 laws of God are based on the Kinetic tree of life, which was referred to among several names as the Port Neteru, or the company of the gods. Kabbalah students and experts alike are surely wondering about my assignment of 11 spheres of the tree in the Hebraic tradition, and its Greek offshoot, so-called Kabbalah, claims that there are only 10 spheres on the tree. The problem lies in understanding the word that is translated as sphere. For some reason, it should have been, but was not clearly understood by the Hebrew Kabbalists as a place or environment within which a thing exists and originates from. The spheres on the tree of life correspond then to the principle and forces that influence man's thinkings, feelings, actions, and destiny. They are best thought of as spheres of influence. That's a tongue twister. The tree of life is nothing more than a system for classifying the influences operating in the spirit of man and God. These influences are experienced by all people as urges or inner drives. We are all driven, for example, by the urge to congregate and unite with others, marriage, family, nation. This urge originates from the first sphere of influence, Oser, of the Kemetic tree, Kethar of the Hebraic. We are all driven by the urges to happiness. We don't engage in a host of life pursuits for their own sake. At the end, there has to be the enjoyment and satisfaction in marriages, career, mountain climbing, and etc. The urge to happiness is closely aligned with the universal drive for inner peace. No one seeks aggravation. It is peace that we need for healing and the optimal functioning of our faculties. The urge originates from the zero sphere of influence, Amen, of the Kemetic tree. It is the influence in our lives that was misunderstood by the Hebrews. They thought that the Ani Sofa is incomprehensible to man. Truth is, it is the root of the tree, hence of man's being. It corresponds to the original unconditioned and undifferentiated state of the energy and substance that is modified, conditioned to form man's vehicle, the soul, the mind, and the body, of manifestation in the world. It remains at the core of our being, beckoning to us to return or to manifest it in our daily life. It is the Hetep of Kemetic spiritual teachings and the Nirvana of Hinduism. It is our original peaceful state that we must reclaim and manifest in place of pain and suffering that robs us of our bid for happiness. You see, people don't understand. They think just peace is just like being at one with all things. I'm at peace. Peace is a healing influence. When one is going through stress, turbulent times, trauma, you can withdraw your spirit into the peace, hetep state. And not only will that settle the animal spirit, but it's a healing energy. This is not only difference between the Kemetic and Hebraic tree of life. Throughout this book, serious students of Kabbalah will note these. There is no intention of criticizing the Hebraic system. The differences have been pointed out to simply put the reader on notice that they are not the products of ignorance of the subject matter. The reader must set aside, if only temporary, other teachings that he or she received to clear the way for the understanding of the material taught in this book. A set of principles organized through the tree of life acquire properties not unlike those of polygons, i.e., their meaning and values are derived from their interrelationship. That's important to note that. What you're seeing on the tree of life, you cannot look at one sphere or one deity alone. They gain their meaning and values are derived from their interrelationships. Thus, the validity of the assignment of a principle to any sphere of the tree of life is determined by its relationship to other principles through their assignment on the tree, and does not rest, therefore, on tradition or authority. That's very important. I'm going to say that again, because this is getting into like the biblical dogmatic practices of just we follow something, we do it for tradition, or because higher ups say that this is the way it's always been done. Thus, the validity of the assignment of a principle to any sphere on the tree of life is determined by its relationship to other principles through their assignment on the tree, and does not rest, therefore, on tradition or authority. The tree speaks for itself, but I have already proven this in 1990 when I published my Meta Oracle, which works by showing which spheres of influence and its condition on the tree of life, or which part of the spirit is controlling the events the subject inquired from the oracle. The tree speaks for itself. We cannot ignore these influences in our life, and we must give them proper expression. As a matter of fact, everything that is wrong in the world is due to man's misunderstanding and incorrect expressions of these influences. For example, the majority of people believe that the universal urge toward inner peace, amen, nirvana, which is behind the urge to happiness, can be satisfied through success in worldly pursuits. In the course of this book, we will see why this is wrong and impossible, because the influences operating in man's spirit are forces that are immutable in nature, given that they are the same forces operating throughout nature, the force of gravitation, the forces in the atom, of magnetism, etc. We must know the laws that govern them if we hope to gain control over them and express them correctly in our lives. The fact we must or will eventually perish at our own hands. Brian Neffer, November 2003. So our first introduction in the book is to speak about the Kinetic tree of life and the interrelationship and interdependence between all of the deities and the spheres on the tree. This is unlike Western thinking, which seeks to label, define, and see everything as compartmentalized with no relationship to other things. Again, hence why we give rise to racism and sexism. Concrete thinking, left brain thinking, you see people as a race, as a gender, and not as their true selves, which is consciousness, which is divine beings, God man, God woman. Now, I must admit, getting further into this book, we get into some really deep concepts and principles here, all right? So I'm going to take a moment here, just to take a breath before I get into this. Because one of the great things that Raul Neffer is doing is breaking down the spirit to really understand who we are and what are the different aspects of the spirit. And this is just contrary to traditional Christian and Catholicism and Islam, which doesn't dive deep into an understanding of the psyche and how you work. The indivisible duality of being. Let me just see here. Now, the main thing that he covers is the separation between the self and the spirit. And let me just go over a little bit about this, but not too much. There's a lot here. Our being and that of God, as we created in His image, as we are created in its image, is composed of two indivisible entities. It is an individual that is an indivisible duality composed of an entity that is a consciousness that is responsible for voluntarily or willed behavior, and an unconsciousness that is responsible for involuntary and automatic behavior. There's two divisions here that we're talking about. A careful analysis of these two parts of being will show that the act of willing is merely an indication of a potential act and lacks the energy to carry out what has been willed. The carrying out of the will is the task of the unconscious part of being, wherein resides the forces of emotions for the execution of the will. This is why people have such a hard time carrying out their will, for example, to break a bad habit like smoking. One part of the being declares because it's void of energy, while the other executes because it has the energy to do so. So one part of you wills and says, I must do this or I will do this, but it lacks the power to execute it. The other part has the power, but doesn't have the will to declare it. So those are the two divisions. And that confusion creates a lot of problems in our society because we go to these motivational talks by these motivational speakers and we think just because we say, I will work hard on my business, I will succeed at my job, your will is declaring it, but there's no power behind it. I remember when I was working as a project manager, I wrote this new edict and I put it out in the memo form, and I had a friend read it because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't being too harsh. And the first thing he said to me is this has no teeth. How will you enforce this edict? And he was right. So the two divisions are within you. One is declaring something, but has no power to enforce it or to act upon it. And there's one that has the energy or the power to act. This is why people have such a hard time carrying out their will, for example, to break a bad habit like smoking. One part declares because it is devoid of energy, while the other executes because it has the energy to do so. Given the fact that energy is oppositely polarized by matter, we must conclude that the unconscious is composed of energy matter. This grouping establishes by logic the proposition that if one part of the being is composed of energy matter, the other part of the being, consciousness will, is immaterial and devoid of energy. Since consciousness, the self, our identity is immaterial and devoid of energy, it is imperceptible. Now, that's the true you. That's who you really are. You're imperceptible. You cannot be felt, heard, smelled, taste. In the Kemetic spiritual system, this imperceptibility of the self was denoted by a divine principle of Amen, God, the hidden, concealed. We will later see that Amen represents God's identity. We can schematicize the fundamental aspects of being as follows. And it just goes to a diagram here. I want to show this really quick. All right. The two fundamental aspects of your being: immaterial self-identity and a material spirit non-identity. The material self-identity is composed of the will and consciousness. The material spirit, not self, not identity, is composed of energy and matter, which is the power to carry out the will. Note that the immaterial part of being, consciousness will, has this been associated with self-identity. In other words, consciousness is what and who we are. Our identity and willing is what we do. Two different distinctions. Logically, this means that the material energy part of being, the spirit, is not self. Most readers will find this confusing since they have been repeatedly told man is spirit and not the physical body. Man is destined to live in the world as a spirit being and not as a physical being. This is an error that has contributed immensely to the inability of the vast majority of people, so-called gurus and spiritual masters included, to truly give the world an effective system of spiritual cultivation and development. We will see that the 11 laws of God represent the truths governing the behavior of the self, of the spirit, not self, and their interaction to produce the events we call life. The matter is which these two fundamental parts of being manifest in the world and interact with each other is distributed through the 11 centers of spiritual influence, schematized as the tree of life. The schematization of the interaction of the two fundamental parts of being through the 11 spheres of the tree of life tracks a progression of changes from the essential and original state of being, which is oneness, to the substantial and transformed state of being, which is many. The oneness that comes as the many, the individualized, going from the subjective to the objective realm. In other words, we are one being manifesting as many. It's the illusion of individuality. That we are essentially one being, as far as the identity part of our being is concerned, is framed in the attributes of the self. Since the self, consciousness, will, is immaterial, it cannot be divided, multiplied, added, or onto, or subtracted from. The attribute of self was denoted in the Kemetic spirituality as the divine principle aton, A-T-E-M, from which the Greeks derived their concept of the atom, an indivisible unit. Our oneness as part of energy matter, part of our being, is concealed, is framed in the attributes of the essential and original state of energy and matter. Foundation of our vehicle, mind, body. In its original state, our matter is undifferentiated, unobstructed, and not shaped into forms or things, and our energy is in a state of inactivity, state of peace, hetep, nirvana, not moving. This state of being corresponds to zero, amen state, on the tree of life. So undifferentiated meaning you're one. There's no separation. Since our essential and original or true state of being is one of oneness due to the indivisibility of the material self, and in the undivided original state of energy matter, our being is infinite, not matter, not limited, and eternal. Consciousness self is outside of the realm of space and time. This is why I say your consciousness, who you are, exists in 5D, where there is no space and time. Space-time is inseparable, Einstein tells us. From this, it follows logically that the process known as creation can only be a transformation, division, and modification of a portion of the limitless expanse of matter. It is a progression from the peaceful external one to the appearance of the many, separated, energized, emotionally, mortal, non-eternal, finite beings. This is why the term individuals, indivisible duality, has been coined to designate ourselves. The duals that can be divided are the elements of our essential and true state, which is oneness, and our manifested state, which is the separation as the many. The process through which the separation of one indivisible consciousness, God self, is the apparent many is achieved through the modifications of energy matter. We are all like one light, consciousness self, passing through translucent panes of different colors, modified energy matter, and manifesting as different and separate lights of different colors. The failure to relate properly to this reality of being is behind the many problems experienced in the world. The vast majority see only the differences, which are superficial, and fall into the trap of declaring others as enemies, competitors, threats, cannon fodder, commodities. Let me say that again. Let me read that again. The failure to relate properly to this reality of being, which is oneness, is behind the many problems experienced in the world. The vast majority see only the differences, which are superficial, Maya, illusion, and fall into the trap of declaring others as enemies, competitors, threats, cannon fodder, and commodities. This is why you have the racial totem pole. White people are on the top, black people on the bottom, all the other races in between, because there's a failure to see the oneness. Others learn or recognize the underneath the superficial differences are elements that unite us into one being, but are at a loss on how intelligently and safely unite with those who are out to do them harm. The agents that take our being from its state of essential oneness to the manifestation as many is a dual stream, in which one is composed of the shaping factors of unity and the other stream is composed of shaping factors of division. It is the harmonization of these two streams and the essential oneness with the manifested differentiation that is the subject of the 11 laws of the spirit. We can schematicize this on the tree of life as seen in the diagram at the end of this chapter. I'm going to read that again. The agents that take our being from its state of essential oneness with all, You can't, and that's who you are. You can't add to or subtract from your original state. To the manifestation as many is a dual stream in which one is composed of shaping factors of unity. Even in that dual stream of oneness and individuality or individualization, there is unity. And the other stream is composed of shaping factors of division. It is the harmonization of these two streams and the essential oneness with the manifested differentiation that is the subject of the 11 laws of spirit. You look at on the tree of life, the Port Nutaru, there's no contradiction. All of the spheres are integral parts of the whole and work together to form a whole and to function as one. The relationship between the self and the spirit. Another underlying layer of information that we must have before we can understand the laws of the spirit concern the relationship between the self and the spirit. It was stated that the self, which is consciousness itself, and whose function is to will, is immaterial and thus devoid of energy. On the other hand, spirit is material and energetic and devoid of consciousness and will. It is very important to understand the separation of functions amongst the two fundamental components of our being. To will is to activate a faculty that is devoid of matter and energy. Again, in my analogy, I tell you the left brain wills and the right brain has the power to carry out the will. This is why sitting in sermons on Sunday, listening to your pastor, Christian minister, recite Psalms, Proverbs, does you no good because it's retained. Yes, you hear and you comprehend, but that's a left brain thing, and the left brain doesn't have the power to carry it out. So you go home on Sunday night, and then Monday you back to your evil and devilish ways, and then you wonder how come you are not a spiritual person, because the religion has failed you. The religion doesn't even understand the components of your spirit, of your mind. It doesn't understand one fundamental fact, that you're divided into the will and the energy to carry out the will. It doesn't understand that sermons mean nothing if they're not taken into a trance state or through hypnosis to reprogram you, which empowers you to do the correct things. This is why you have people going around, especially a lot of women, calling themselves Maat and do the wrong things. Because Maat is not studying just laws. It's a spiritual way of life that encompasses learning principles, especially the 11 laws in the trance state, to empower the will to carry out correct behavior. On the other hand, the spirit is material and energetic and devoid of consciousness and will. It is very important to understand this separation of functions amongst the two fundamental components of our being. To will is to activate a faculty that is devoid of matter and energy. It cannot therefore carry out the action. That it signals. To speak of a weak will is to betray an ignorance that speaks volumes as to the causes of failure in life, ignorance of the knowledge of self. On the other hand, spirit, which is devoid of consciousness and will, cannot be a prime initiator of its manifestations in and as the world. Manifestations, creations in the realm of the sphere of being, as well as in man, consciousness is initiated by the act of its formless tool of action, the will. Even the idea that is carried by the will subsists in a formless, immaterial state. In response to the will, the energy, matter, spirit, which was in a state of non-differentiation and repose, peace, is set in motion, emotion, which causes the matter to assume the form implied in the immaterial will of self. It is important to know that while the self as man knows what it wants to manifest, what it is willing, and why, it does not know how and when this will develop. In other words, the self belongs the what and the why, and to the spirit, the how and the when. It is the truths governing the attributes of self, of the spirit and their relationship that constitute the laws of the spirit. Woo! That's a mouthful, man. He said a lot there. I mean, that's a lot. I've read that a number of times, and still, it's very meaty. Let's go over that again. On the other hand, spirit, which is devoid of consciousness and will, cannot be the prime initiator of its manifestations in and as the world. Manifestations, creations in the realm of the Supreme Being, as well as in man, consciousness is initiated by the acts of its formless tool of action, the will. Even the idea that is carried out by the will subsists in a formless, immaterial state. You're taking from formlessness, immaterial, pulling out to create the material, the physical. In response to the will, the energy matter spirit, which was in a state of non-differentiation and repose, peace, is set in motion. So he's saying here that the energy matter, the spirit, which was in a state of peace, nirvana, and was not individualized or differentiated, it was at a state of peace and rest, is set in motion, which causes the matter to assume a form implied in the immaterial will of the self. It is important to know that while the self in man knows what it wants to manifest, there's that part of you that wants to manifest a new life, money, a mate. You know what you want to manifest and why. It does not know how and when this will develop. In other words, the self belongs to what and why, and the spirit to the how and when. It is the truths governing the attributes of self and the spirit and their relationship that constitutes the laws of the spirit. Okay, man, that's a lot. That is deep. That's deep. You may want to go back and keep reviewing this portion because there was a lot there. Another extremely important factor in the relationship between self consciousness and the spirit is rooted in their differences. Devoid of energy and matter, the self is absolutely free and at peace. This, when you're at peace, you're free. You're free from emotional compulsion. Nothing compels you. You have no likes or dislikes. That's the true state of your being. That's Maat. You're unconditioned. Devoid of energy and matter, the self is absolutely free and at peace. On the other hand, the spirit, an entity of energy and matter, is bound by law, which is a limiting and energetic emotional factor. For the sake of manifestation in the world, the spirit provides bodies for consciousness, and in the process, it subjects consciousness, the self, to limitations on its freedom and superimposes pain and pleasure on its peace. I'm going to read that again. For the sake of manifestation in the world, the spirit provides bodies for consciousness, and in the process, it subjects consciousness, the will, to limitations on its freedom and then superimposes pain and pleasure on it. So the mere fact that you can manifest as a physical being in the world then dictates that there has to be limitations placed upon you, which a net result of that is to experience pain and pleasure in this world. This has a defining effect on life. The self, which is not capable of having experience in its realm of origin, because you as consciousness and exist as one. You have nothing to interact with, so you're not capable of having an experience because there's nothing to interact with. The self, which is not capable of having experience, is in its realm of origin. Energy was at rest and matter unindifferentiated, comes in the world through the forms and forces provided it by spirit, and because these have the opposite effects at first upon its nature, loss of peace, eternity, and infinity. So you give this up, manifesting in this 4D world. You give up peace, eternity, and infinity. It posits as its major striving the reclaiming of its peace, happiness, and its freedom, mastery over the emotions, the force of the spirit and of nature. Its success in this work is crowned with pleasure, properly utilized, and its failures with pain. It is obvious that much more can be said about pain and pleasure to render the preceding statement accurate. The required insight will be given as we go through the various laws. What is important at this point is the realization that the self's ability to reclaim its peace once it has entered the world is the first and most important accomplishment that must be secured. So you give up your amen state, that peace, that oneness, to enter into the physical realm. But your goal is to go back to that peace state and to realize your divinity, realize that you are one with all. You are peace, consciousness. Now, this goes on to talk a little bit more about the purpose of creation. Now that we have an understanding of being, we can move on to gaining an understanding of creation. Before creation, what the Kinetic sages referred to as before the first day, energy was in a state of inactivity, and matter was not yet differentiated into form because the will was in a state of inactivity. As a result, consciousness, God's self, had no things to perceive. Yes, you existed as one. There was nothing else, so you couldn't perceive anything. There was nothing to perceive. And because consciousness is immaterial, indivisible, and non-multipliable, it was one without a second, all alone. There was just you. I am. I am that I am. The only way that experience could come into being was through the self's willing energy to modify matter into forms. From the subjective came the objective realm, and entering into the forms as their indwelling selves. The world was thus created by God that it might enjoy life. Although the consciousness dwelling in all creatures is that of God, remember that consciousness is immaterial, hence indivisible. There is only one creature that has been so created that allows for the fullness expression of God's self in the world. This creature is man. In other words, man, once fully evolved, is God's vehicle in the world. All the other creatures on earth are the earthly vehicles of God's spiritual nature. What differentiates man from all of the creatures, angels included, is the will. He is the only creature that has been given the freedom to choose and to decide to obey or not the laws of nature. While all other creatures are compelled to follow the laws of nature, the spirit, man has the freedom to choose. You can ignore God's will. You have that freedom. You are not compelled to live truth. Does that make sense? Because your will is unconditioned. It's free. Through the process of living life, it becomes conditioned. You take on patterns, emotions, likes and dislikes, but that's not your essential nature. Your essential nature is free. Since man is the worldly vehicle of God's consciousness and will, it must be constituted that to allow the expression of God's freedom. And as we know, the unfolding of the divine consciousness through man is a gradual process. Many cultures have identified three clearly delineated stages. Now, the next chapter, starting on page 15, goes into the three types of man. And as I said before, when we started, that the Kinetic religion was one of the only religions that divided the spirit and understood the operating principles by which man is governed, or man, woman is governed. All the other religions have no concept and understanding of your original nature, why you manifest in this 4D realm. What are the divisions of your spirit? They're intellectually bankrupt. I'm going to read just a couple more pages and then I'm going to get into an overall summation of the rest of the chapters. The three types of man. A careful study of the spiritual teachings of the advanced cultures will reveal a division of humanity into three groups: the human, man proper, and God, man, woman. The defining principle is the will. The human is so labeled to denote that it is an earthly being, humanus, earth, man, or human, This label denotes the kind of mankind, whose will is so undeveloped, it is asleep, that the earthly part of being, emotions, and sensuality, the unconsciousness, determines his or her behavior and destiny. This is so true. We are asleep and underdeveloped, not due to our own faults. As I said, society failed us. The nation failed us. They have not put together institutions and a civilization that cultivates within us spiritual principles because they don't know thyself. Therefore, you have people acting against their nature, acting animalistic, engaged in criminal behavior. But instead of holding the institutions accountable for this failure, we lock the individuals up and then apply laws disproportionately. Let me go on. In addition, because the will is relatively still asleep, the mental process is dominated by the acceptance of associated thought drift activity. The reasoning process is low and incompetent. Belief and faith take the place of reason and knowledge. So modern religions just say, we don't understand how the spirit works, the different divisions of the spirit, the afterlife, but just have faith and belief. It's ignorant thinking. Our Kemetic ancestors were scientists. They categorized all this. They understood the makeup of man and woman and what caused you to act in certain ways. The second category is the man proper. The will has reached full maturity. It has awakened, and the entity's chief identifying mark is the struggle to impose the will on the emotions and sensuality. This is the fight of Haru and Set. To impose your will, Haru, on your lowly animalistic emotions, Set. To achieve mastery over the emotions, the unconsciousness. In addition, because the will is fully active, the mental process is dominated by reason and knowledge. The third category corresponds to the man that has consummated the union between the will and the unconscious, has recovered the original state of unity and peace, hetep, nirvana. Here, there is no struggle because spiritual power has been added to the faculties of external actions and wisdom. Intuition has been added to reason. The Hindus refer to these three stages as Tamistic, Rajastic, and Stivik, respectively. The Taoists refer to these types of man as the inferior man, superior man, and the sage. Drawing from the Kemetic cosmology, I have designated them as Sahu man, Ab man, and Ba man, according to the vision of the spirit they have attained to. So we all, starting at the low level of the tree of life, start out as Sahu. We climb to the Maat level, we're Ab men and women. We go higher, we're Ba. Man's goal in life is the same as the God of enjoyment of life's happiness. We will see as we go through this book that to realize this goal, man must first realize his or her divinity, because the vehicle of God's consciousness in the world become the vehicle of God's consciousness in the world. It's the only way that man would be able to overcome the many obstacles that life on earth brings. So this is the resurrection of a seer within you. Become God on earth through to this living Ma'at, spiritual cultivation. It must be understood that all experiences are leading us to that realization. One thing that we all have in common is the need for knowledge and power to carry out life's activities, and the challenges in the world are of such magnitude that men are compelled to search deep within for sources of a kind of knowledge and power that will help them to prevail. Those who have found them have labeled them wisdom and power. And while most people may think that these are the providence of a few gifted men and women, which is not true, we must understand that what we call wisdom and spiritual power is simply the manifestation in man of God's omniscience and omnipotence. Becoming a vehicle for the manifestation of God in the world is not a matter of gifts or grace, but is a result of observing the laws of God. You have access to God's wisdom and God's spiritual power. Tuning into the right frequency on that sphere on the tree of life can give you access to those abilities. But the religions, Christian, Judaism, Catholicism, will lie to you and say these special talents or attributes are only for a select few gifted men, never women, but men who God speaks to. That is not true. And the only reason they say that is out of ignorance, because they don't understand that how you can tune into these powers. So they think that God selects individuals to gift them with these powers or to speak with. That's ridiculousness. God doesn't favor anyone. God is no respecter of persons. What are the laws of God? Let's begin by making it clear that the laws of God bear no resemblance to man's laws. They are not injunctions or commandments to be obeyed. They are not rules, prohibitions, or regulations prescribed to govern the behavior of man. Neither are they conventions that sages have met and agreed upon. We are all sages, so we go to conventions and we agree that these certain laws will be implemented into the nation. That's how Western society is. That's what the Roman Emperor Constantine did in 325 AD. Just decide, oh, we're going to worship Mary over Jesus. I'm sorry, we're going to worship Jesus over Mary, and we're going to strip out some of these books of the Bible. Just did that, like arbitrarily. No wisdom associated with what they're doing. No understanding of how the Spirit works. They are principles that explain the nature and interaction of the forces and principles that influence man's life, his or her thinking, feelings, actions, and destiny. The observance of these principles will enable the individual to live in harmony with these principles and forces, thus gaining access to God's wisdom and spiritual power. All else that is needed or is important in life will follow. They apply to 11 spheres of spiritual influence operating in man's spirit and the world. The presentation of laws does not appeal to faith, belief, or comprehension through some yet unmanifested higher spiritual faculty. They appeal to man's reasoning power and common sense. Religion, modern day religion, is devoid of logic and common sense. They aim at providing man with an unshakable conviction based on logically derived understanding, given that it is thus the power of the Spirit is mobilized to fully act in the world. There might seem to be a contradiction in the presentation of the laws of God as being based on logical reasoning. The contradiction exists only in the minds of people who have failed to understand the foundations of science and of religion. Science and religion in ancient Africa did not conflict with one another. The word science comes from the Latin "sciere," meaning to know, actually rules for determining that something is truly known. To oppose and exclude science from the spiritual and religious domain is to say that there is incapacity to obtain true knowledge regarding God and the shaping factors of spirituality and religion. This may be true of some religions, especially those that have been erected upon belief and faith. It is simple. If you can prove a point, especially with the certainty provided by the scientific method, then you wouldn't have to ask someone to believe or to have faith in your presentation. We do not say that we have faith or believe that combining two atoms of hydrogen with one of oxygen will result in the formation of water. We know. It's a fact. The erroneous argument that places religion and spirituality in a separate category from science, mathematics, and logic, belief and faith versus reason and knowledge will be fully refuted in the course of this book. This is not the first time such knowledge has been unveiled. It is well known to a few scholars that several religions of antiquity were not based on faith or belief, but on knowledge. Such Some such were the Gnostic Greek for knowledge, religion, religions of Greece, the mysteries of Orpheus and Elysius, Mithraism of the Persians and ancient Roman Empire, and many others, most of which derived from the religious systems of Kemet, ancient Egypt. The connection between religion with logic, law, and science can be inferred from the coining of certain relevant words. The term religion is related to the Indo-European root leg, which means to collect or connect, from whence the Greek legin and the Latin legere, meaning logic and legal. The men who coined these words connected religion to law and logic, which determines the legitimate connection between things. There was no thought of separating religion from the domain of logical thinking. This book will make that clear. Religion and science should align. There should be no separation. This is how we as a society have become so backwards. In fact, I was talking to one young gentleman, and I told him how in ancient Kemet, there were no disciplines, there were no various lines of demarcation, that the science, the math, the history was all intermingled. This is integrated thinking. This is synthesis, Maat thinking. Now, I'm going to stop at page 20 because he gives a diagram here, which is this schematic diagram of a dualization here. You can check that out there. But what I want to talk about is a summation of the book, so you get a fully understanding of what this book is about. So as we go further, the book dives into each sphere of the tree of life and each of the deities, and it gives you the principles by which they operate, the shaping factors, the governing forces upon man. We cover Tahuti, Sekert, Heteru, Sebek, Isis, Haru, Harukahuti. So the book goes through those and basically gives you what we call is the truisms for you to live by. And it explains in a very logical and scientific manner how each of these deities or these principles impact you in your life and how to call upon these forces for help. You understand? And one of the first ones that he dives into is the law of Amen, which is 0, the tree of life. Let me just go over that. There is a world of a difference in being able to say that you believe in God's existence versus saying that you know that God exists. The difference is not readily apparent to most people as they do not have a keen understanding of the meaning of the word belief. Let's say there is a pot of beans on the stove, and it usually takes between 60 and 90 minutes to thoroughly cook this type of beans. What would be your response if asked if the beans are thoroughly cooked at 60-minute point? And you could not actually check the beans. You only have time to estimate to suggest an answer, as there is an obvious element of doubt due to the absence of evidence. You can only answer with "I don't know," or "I believe so," or it is possible," or "maybe not." And let's say that you are given a multiple choice test in which your life depends on the correct answer. You are asked to choose the correct answer to the question above. Statement A, I know that the beans are thoroughly cooked. Statement B, I believe that the beans are thoroughly cooked. Since the time element suggests that the beans could be cooked, B is the correct answer. While it is easy to see in this example and many others alike that we express belief when we lack proof and are thus not able to say that we know, most people cannot see the principle when they express belief in God's existence as opposed to expressing that they do not know, have proof that God exists. To say I believe is to say I don't know. Before you rush to say that you do know, let's understand that the expression of knowledge requires given proof. And proof requires the presentation of evidence that must be universally accepted to everyone, evidence that cannot be argued away. It is because of evidence that we know and don't believe in the existence of sea mammals, dinosaurs, volcanoes, electricity. Let me read that again. It's because of evidence that we know and don't believe in the existence of sea mammals, dinosaurs, volcanoes, and electricity. We don't believe that if we make contact with a certain amount of electricity, voltage, for a certain amount of time, that it will kill us. We know, knowing versus believing. Like, I know I'm pretty. I don't believe I'm pretty. I know I'm pretty. There's a difference. Understand that. To clearly understand these differences, it's important to note that when we experience an object, there is always the properties of the object itself, the objective side, and our ideas and feelings about the object, the subjective side. In other words, the object as it is, independent of us, and what is in the mind of the subject dependent on us. To one person, the day will be warm, and to another, it will be hot. And they can argue for days about it and never agree. This is the nature of subjective expression. On the other hand, they will all have to agree if it is said that it is 70 degrees Celsius objective expression. When our experience of the world is expressed in objective language, we must all agree because we are making a statement that denotes the object as it is, or agree with a universally accepted standard or universally recognized category. When we use subjective language, many will disagree because the statement denotes that we think or how we feel, which can also be different from one speaker to another. Subjective expressions are therefore categorized as beliefs, while objective expressions are categorized as knowledge. With the understanding in place, we must look at the fact that most religions have failed to explain God's being as an objective matter that all would have to agree. You say you believe or have faith because you can't explain something or a process with the objective universal agreement that accompanies a subjection of water at 32 Celsius to get ice. I'm going to say that again. You say you believe or have faith because you can't explain something or a process with the objectivity universal agreement that accompanies the subjection of water at 32 degrees Celsius to get ice. And since you can't say that you know, there's always room for doubt and belief, always room for the faith to be shaken, or as most people do, simply go about their lives in a fashion that does not, in reality, take into account their belief in God or their religious doctrines despite lip service. How, for example, can a scientist, so called, be comfortable with the declaration of belief in God, yet support a theory of creation that does not or cannot objectively, universally agreeable manner place God at the helm of creation? This is the Big Bang theory. They believe some scientists will believe in God, but then they support the Big Bang theory, which is doesn't support um, divine intelligence. Universally agreeable manner place God at the helm of creation. How can a politician declare God to be the ruler of the world, yet separate the state from God? Leave God out of school and government. Could it be they neither know God or science? Should God be the dominant factor in the lives of religious or spiritual people? An in-depth analysis of people's lives will show that this is not so. While most critics try to lay blame on the people themselves, charging them with hypocrisy, the blame rests with the religious and spiritual systems themselves. This is what I've been saying, that the institutions have failed the individuals and not the individuals. The religion has failed the people and not vice versa. What role God plays in a person's life depends on whether the person believes in God, God's being, or has knowledge of God's being. The religions have confused people so much that they don't explain scientifically things that people have questions to. In fact, they just interject belief, faith, instead of logically and reasoning out why God exists, why they exist. But see, these people are ignorant, they're deaf, dumb, and blind, and they're leading other people off the cliff. You see, One of the greatest damages done to the world was the declaration by Western scientists that science contradicts religion, that one of the greatest advancements in man's intelligence, in fact, a miracle, occurred when the Greeks took God out of the picture of creation. To account for the absence of an intelligent being responsible for creation, Western scientists invented the concept of chance and random activity. So that goes back to the Big Bang Theory. We just say, oh, the Big Bang happened and everything just organized in the right way chemically to induce life. That's absurd. My answer to such notions is that the Greeks unwittingly managed to separate defective views about science from defective views about God, and no one noticed. Fact is, the more you understand logic, mathematics, science, the closer you will get to God. We will begin our inductive quest with the consideration of two Western concepts. The first concept states that the creation of matter and the world began with the Big Bang, gases. As a result of certain forces acting upon them, exploded, generating a great amount of heat that upon cooling down formed the elements. First hydrogen was created, then helium, and so on. The second concept states that the elements so produced came together by chance and formed living things, which in the course of time created intelligence, carbon-based life forms. What would your conclusion What would be your conclusion if you traveled to a distant uninhabited planet and found a stack of bricks exactly alike in size and weight, some set up according to a geometric series, while other group was arranged to make the letters of the alphabet? Would you not conclude that some intelligent being got there before you and was responsible for the arrangement? No, duh. Yeah, of course. You know what I mean? So somehow scientists have missed the fact that following the Big Bang, the creation of the elements proceeding according to strict mathematical rules, Maat. This is why when we get to the creation of the world, or creation of all that there is, Neter, God, Nebuchadnezzar, first laid down and put forth Ma'at, to have a foundation for the basis of everything to come after it, because Ma'at is order. Okay, so it's gone. All elements are made up of some components just configured differently. The progression from one element to the next follows a strict mathematical pattern in which the underlying properties of each element are repeated in the element 8 places away. That shows a pattern. The cyclic or periodic return of qualities is the basis of arrangement, the elements into the periodic table of the elements. We must also note that although each element is different, their structure all follows the same pattern. We understand God's existence, but there's two things that we must consider: the implicit and the explicit. We understand God's existence through the implicit. We see evidence of God's existence from Ma'at, the interdependence and interrelationship between all things on the planet, the ecosystem. We know that the bees pollinate. There's an interdependence, interrelationship there. There's an intelligence there. We know that man adapts. We know that man first began in the great continent of Pangaea and then migrated outward to Europe, and then through the process of adaptation lost his melanin and pigmentation. And he lost his melanin and pigmentation and became European or white man. And the reason he did that because of the divine intelligence that says you must survive. So in order for you to survive, I will create adaptation to your environment, or else you will perish. This is implicit that God's existence, of God's existence. Now, on the explicit level, you may not see evidence of God's existence. So let's go on. All elements are made up of the same components. I said that. The fundamental unit of the element is the atom, and the atoms are composed of positively charged particles named protons, named protons, neutral particles named neutrons, which together occupy the center of the atom, the nucleus. Swirling around the nucleus are negatively charged particles named electrons. What I want to call your attention next is the configuration of these electrons. They swirl around the nucleus in different orbits called shells. The first shell, all right, I'm going to stop here because he gets into some deep stuff math here, you know what I mean? Showing the patterns of the periodic table of elements, you know, which leads into the proof of God's existence. So I'm going to leave off at page 26 here, because the rest gets into a mouthful. But as I said before, as we dive into the chapters, we start getting into the meat and potatoes, which is the tree of life, the different deities, their governing forces, and how they impact you in your life. Because Maat is cosmologics. And this is what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with the Greek and Roman idea of gods and goddesses that are self-contained and compartmentalized. We're looking at these deities and their relationships on the tree of life and how they interrelate with each other, how they're halves of a whole. And from reviewing this, we can extrapolate how one should be thinking, relational thinking, synthesis, which will better help us to construct a world that is harmonious, that doesn't have contradictions and oppositions and enemies. This is what Ma'at is all about. And when we talk about Ma'at is sharing, giving, seeking nothing in return, even to your enemy, that's a high expression of truth. That's a high expression of love. And a lot of people can't deal with that because they're based in the lower aspect of their spirit, the Sahu nature, which is animalistic and selfish. And they don't understand that the world or the universe, the principle of the universe is abundance. So you can share without worry or fear that you will one day be in lack. But the only way you can really understand that is if you rise your consciousness to a higher level, to Ma'at thinking. And with that, I want to bring this to a close, this first books club session, Ma'at Book Club, on the 11 laws of God. And we will continue next week at this very same time. This is Kasak Ma'at Kaparu, son of Ma'at and Tahuti. Ma'at is the beautiful goddess Heteru. Until my next video, Amen Ra, and thank you for your support and taking the time to join us on this book club.